I'm Jessica Thompson, and I'll never forget the moment I walked into that Phoenix courtroom using a walker, my surgical scars still visible beneath my blouse. My parents sat in the front row with their lawyer, confident smirks on their faces, probably thinking their sick daughter would never have the strength to fight them. But when they saw the woman walking beside me, carrying a thick folder of evidence, my mother's face went white as hospital sheets. My father actually stood up and whispered, "How did she find out? Tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you." That folder contained proof of something so twisted, so calculated, that even seasoned court reporters would later say they'd never heard anything like it. They thought they could steal from me while I lay unconscious, fighting for my life after emergency surgery. They believed their plan was foolproof, that I'd be too weak, too grateful, too damaged to ever discover what they'd done. But here's what they didn't count on. Sometimes the people who underestimate you the most give you exactly the motivation you need to destroy them. It started on what should have been an ordinary Tuesday evening in Phoenix. I was 25, working as a graphic designer for a downtown marketing agency, living my quiet, independent life in a small apartment near the Arts District. That night, I was finishing up a client presentation when the most excruciating pain I'd ever experienced tore through my abdomen. It felt like someone was stabbing me with a red-hot knife, twisting it deeper with every breath I tried to take. I called my best friend Amanda, who worked as a nurse at Phoenix General Medical Center. Through my tears and gasps of pain, I managed to describe what was happening. Her voice immediately shifted to that professional, urgent tone I'd heard her use during emergencies. She told me to hang up and call an ambulance immediately, that it sounded like my appendix, and that I needed to get to a hospital within the hour, or risk serious complications. The ambulance ride felt like a nightmare. Every bump in the Phoenix streets sent waves of agony through my body, and I remember thinking this couldn't be happening to me. I was healthy, active, the kind of person who rarely even caught a cold. The paramedics kept checking my vitals, and I could see concern growing in their eyes as my blood pressure dropped and my temperature spiked. At Phoenix General, everything became a blur of bright lights, urgent voices, and the antiseptic smell that would haunt me for months afterward. Dr. Patricia Williams, the surgeon on call, examined me quickly and confirmed Amanda's suspicion. My appendix hadn't just become inflamed, it was on the verge of rupturing, which could lead to sepsis and potentially death. She explained that they needed to operate immediately, that there was no time to waste on lengthy discussions or second opinions. I was scared, more terrified than I'd ever been in my life, but I managed to call my parents before they wheeled me into surgery. My mother Linda answered on the third ring, and when I explained where I was and what was happening, her response chilled me even in my fevered state. Instead of the concern or panic I expected, she sounded almost annoyed, as if I'd interrupted something important. She said they were at a business dinner for the family insurance agency, that my brother Mike was there discussing expansion plans, and that they'd try to make it to the hospital later if they could. Try to make it if they could. Those words echoed in my mind, as the anesthesia mask covered my face and the world faded to black. My parents, who lived only 30 minutes away, couldn't be bothered to leave a dinner meeting when their daughter was facing emergency surgery. But I told myself that once the surgery was over, once they realized how serious it had been, they'd be there when I woke up. The surgery that was supposed to take an hour stretched to nearly 4. Dr. Williams later explained that my appendix had indeed ruptured during the operation, spilling infected material throughout my abdominal cavity. They'd had to perform extensive cleaning and irrigation to prevent sepsis, and there had been complications with bleeding that required additional procedures. When I finally opened my eyes in the recovery room, the first thing I noticed was how quiet it was. No voices of concerned family members. No flowers or get-well cards. Just the steady beeping of monitors and the soft footsteps of nurses checking on other patients. I turned my head, expecting to see my parents or at least my brother Mike, but the visitor's chair beside my bed was empty. A kind nurse named Jennifer noticed I was awake and came over to check my vitals. When I asked if anyone had come to see me, her expression grew uncomfortable. She said my father had called asking about visiting hours, but that no one had actually come to the hospital. As the hours passed, and the pain medication began to wear off, the physical agony was nothing compared to the emotional devastation of lying there alone. Other patients had streams of visitors, flowers, balloons, the normal signs of people who were loved and missed. My room remained eerily quiet except for Amanda, who stopped by during her breaks when she could. She was furious with my family, her face flushed with anger as she ranted about how she couldn't believe they weren't there. The next morning brought complications that Dr. Williams hadn't anticipated. Internal bleeding had developed overnight, requiring another emergency procedure. As they prepared to wheel me back into surgery, I was barely conscious but aware enough to hear Dr. Williams speaking with a hospital administrator about emergency contacts. She'd been trying to reach my family to inform them about the additional surgery, but my father had simply said they were busy and asked her to call back later. This second surgery lasted even longer than the first, and when I woke up, I had tubes and monitors attached to me that hadn't been there before. My abdomen was distended and painful, and I could barely move without assistance. Dr. Williams explained that the internal bleeding had been more severe than expected, that I'd needed a blood transfusion, and that my recovery would now take weeks rather than days. She also mentioned with obvious discomfort that she'd been unable to reach my family to update them on my condition. During those first few critical days, when infection was still a serious risk and my body was fighting to heal from 2 major surgeries, I lay in that hospital bed wondering what I'd done to deserve such abandonment. I replayed conversations with my parents, searching for clues about why they seemed so indifferent to my suffering. Yes, I'd always been somewhat distant from them, preferring my independence to the suffocating dynamics of family gatherings. And yes, I knew they favored my brother Mike, who was everything they wanted in a child, successful, charming, involved in the family business. But surely, I thought, medical emergencies transcended normal family politics. Surely the possibility of losing a child would override whatever disappointment they felt about my life choices. I was wrong about that, just as I was wrong about so many other things I'd discover in the coming weeks. On my 4th day in the hospital, still weak and barely able to sit up without assistance, Mike finally made an appearance. He strolled into my room like he was doing me an enormous favor, carrying a small bouquet of grocery store flowers that looked like an afterthought. He was dressed in one of his expensive suits, fresh from showing houses to clients, and his entire demeanor suggested that visiting his hospitalized sister was an inconvenience he could barely tolerate. He pulled the visitor's chair close to my bed, but instead of asking how I was feeling or expressing concern about my condition, he immediately launched into what sounded like a rehearsed speech. He explained that our parents were extremely busy with expanding the insurance agency.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
That they were in the middle of crucial negotiations that could determine the future of the family business. He said they were very concerned about me, of course, but that they trusted the doctors to take good care of me and didn't want to get in the way of my recovery by hovering around the hospital. His words felt hollow, scripted, as if someone had coached him on exactly what to say to make their absence seem reasonable. But it was what he said next that made my blood run cold, even in my weakened state. He mentioned that our grandmother's estate was finally being settled, that there were some papers I'd need to sign once I was feeling better. He said it casually, as if it were just another mundane detail to handle, but something in his tone made me pay closer attention. Our grandmother had passed away 6 months earlier, and I knew she'd left me something in her will. She'd always had a soft spot for me, probably because I reminded her of herself as a young woman, independent and artistic. During her final months, when I'd visit her at the assisted living facility, she'd often talk about wanting to make sure I was taken care of, that I'd have something to help me pursue my dreams without having to depend on anyone else. When I asked Mike for more details about the estate, his answers became vague and evasive. He said the lawyers were handling everything, that it was complicated because of tax implications, and that I shouldn't worry about it while I was recovering. He promised they'd discuss it in detail once I was back on my feet, but for now, I should focus on getting better. Something about his manner, the way he avoided eye contact when talking about the inheritance, sent warning signals through my foggy medication-influenced mind. After Mike left, promising to relay my greetings to our parents, I lay there feeling more alone than ever. Even his brief visit had felt more like an obligation than genuine care, and his evasive answers about grandmother's estate left me with a nagging sense that something wasn't right. But I was too weak, too focused on the basic challenge of healing from major surgery, to pursue those concerns immediately. The days blended together in a haze of pain medications, physical therapy sessions, and the slow, frustrating process of recovering from severe abdominal surgery. Each day, I hoped my parents would surprise me by walking through that hospital door, that they'd realize how serious my condition had been, and feel compelled to make up for their absence. Each day, I was disappointed anew. Amanda became my lifeline during those long, lonely weeks. She'd stop by during her breaks, bringing me real food when the hospital meals became unbearable, helping me walk the hallways when I was strong enough to start moving around, and most importantly, listening to my growing concerns about my family's behavior. She'd known my parents for years, had witnessed their favoritism toward Mike, and their general dismissiveness toward my achievements, but even she was shocked by their complete abandonment during such a vulnerable time. It was Amanda who first suggested that something more sinister might be happening. During one of her visits, as I expressed my confusion about Mike's evasive answers regarding the inheritance, she leaned forward with that serious expression she got when she was about to say something important. She reminded me that I'd been completely incapacitated for over 2 weeks, first in a coma from the anesthesia and complications, then barely conscious from pain medications. She pointed out that during that time, if someone had medical power of attorney, or if there were legal documents that needed signing, I would have been in no condition to protect my interests. Her words planted a seed of suspicion that began growing despite my attempts to dismiss it, as paranoia brought on by medication and emotional trauma. Surely my own parents wouldn't take advantage of my medical crisis to manipulate legal or financial matters. Surely there were limits to their selfishness and favoritism, but as the days passed, and their continued absence became impossible to explain away, I began to consider possibilities that would have seemed unthinkable just weeks earlier. The turning point came during my 3rd week in the hospital, when I was finally strong enough to make phone calls and handle basic administrative tasks. I decided to contact my grandmother's lawyer directly to ask about the status of her estate. What I discovered during that phone call changed everything and set in motion a chain of events that would ultimately lead to that confrontation in the Phoenix courthouse. The lawyer, an elderly man named Mr. Peterson, who had handled my grandmother's affairs for decades, seemed surprised to hear from me. He explained that he'd been trying to reach me for weeks, but had been told by my father that I was unavailable due to medical issues. He said there were indeed papers that needed my signature, but more importantly, he revealed details about my grandmother's bequest that Mike had never mentioned. My grandmother hadn't just left me a small keepsake or a few $1,000s, as my brother had implied. She'd established a trust fund specifically for me, worth $150,000, intended to help me start my own graphic design business or pursue whatever dreams I had. The money was meant to be mine alone, with specific instructions that it not be shared with other family members or used for family business purposes. She'd been very explicit about wanting me to have complete independence and control over this inheritance. But here's where the conversation with Mr. Peterson took a dark turn that made my hands shake as I held the phone. He explained that someone claiming to have medical power of attorney had been pressuring him to release the funds early, citing my incapacitation and the need to manage my affairs during my recovery. He'd refused so far, insisting that such a large sum required my direct authorization, but he'd been receiving increasingly aggressive calls from my father demanding immediate access to the money. As Mr. Peterson described these interactions, a horrifying picture began to emerge. My family hadn't abandoned me during my medical crisis out of callousness or busy schedules. They'd been actively working behind the scenes to exploit my vulnerability, to use my incapacitation as an opportunity to steal an inheritance that my grandmother had specifically intended for me alone. The timing wasn't coincidental. They'd known about my grandmother's bequest, and my medical emergency had presented them with what they saw as the perfect opportunity to claim it. That night, unable to sleep despite the pain medications, I stared at the hospital ceiling and tried to process the magnitude of what was happening. My parents, the people who were supposed to protect me when I was most vulnerable, had instead seen my suffering as an opportunity for profit. They'd left me to face major surgery and life-threatening complications alone, not because they didn't care, but because they were too busy plotting to rob me while I was unconscious. The next morning, I called Amanda and asked her to help me with something that would require her discretion and her access to hospital records. What we discovered together would provide the evidence I needed to prove that my family's abandonment hadn't been neglect but calculated exploitation, and it would ultimately give me the ammunition I needed to destroy them in that Phoenix courtroom, where they would finally face the consequences of their betrayal. Part 2, the discovery phase. What Amanda and I uncovered in those hospital records would haunt me for months afterward. As a nurse with administrative access, she could pull up documentation that ordinary patients never see, the behind-the-scenes communications between doctors, social workers and family members that paint the real picture of what happens when someone is truly vulnerable and alone. Amanda arrived at my room early that morning, before her shift officially started, carrying 2 cups of real coffee instead of the watery hospital version I'd been choking down for weeks. Her expression was grim as she settled into the visitor's chair, and I could tell she'd already begun investigating based on our conversation the night before. She pulled out a small notebook where she'd been jotting down information, and what she told me made my stomach clench with something far worse than surgical pain. The day after my first surgery, when I was still unconscious and fighting off infection, my father had contacted the hospital's patient advocacy department, but he hadn't called to check on my condition or ask about visiting procedures. Instead, he'd inquired about the process for obtaining emergency medical power of attorney for an incapacitated adult child. He'd claimed that I had no advance directives, no healthcare proxy, and that as my father, he needed legal authority to make medical decisions on my behalf. Amanda's voice grew tighter as she continued reading from her notes. The patient advocate had explained that such authority typically required court involvement, unless there were existing legal documents, and that the process could take several days even in emergency situations. My father had seemed frustrated by this information, pressing for faster alternatives, and asking specifically about situations where family members might need to make financial decisions related to medical care. That conversation alone might have seemed like normal parental concern, but it was what happened next that revealed the true scope of their planning. Within hours of that initial call, my mother had contacted the hospital's billing department with questions about payment procedures for extended care. She'd claimed that I had significant assets that might need to be liquidated to cover medical expenses, and she'd asked about the documentation required to access patient funds in cases of incapacitation. The billing representative had explained that hospitals typically work directly with insurance companies and patients themselves, that family members couldn't authorize payment from patient accounts without proper legal documentation. My mother had grown argumentative during this conversation, insisting that as parents, they should have automatic authority over their adult child's finances during medical emergencies. When told this wasn't the case, she demanded to speak with supervisors and threatened to transfer me to a different facility. Amanda paused in her recounting to take a sip of coffee, and I could see the anger building in her eyes. She'd worked in hospitals long enough to recognize the difference between concerned family members navigating a crisis and people trying to exploit the system for personal gain. What she told me next made it clear which category my parents fell into. On my third day in the hospital, while I was undergoing the second emergency surgery for internal bleeding, my father had appeared at the hospital's administrative offices with a folder full of documents. He'd claimed that I'd previously granted him power of attorney, but that the paperwork was at home, and he needed temporary authorization to handle urgent financial matters related to my care. He'd been accompanied by Mike, who'd corroborated this story, and added details about my supposed wishes for them to manage my affairs if I ever became incapacitated. The hospital's legal department had been skeptical, particularly since I'd been conscious and coherent when initially admitted, and had made no mention of existing power of attorney arrangements. They'd asked my father to provide the actual documents, rather than just claiming they existed. He'd become increasingly agitated, arguing that time was critical, and that bureaucratic delays could jeopardize my medical care. What made this interaction particularly disturbing was the timing. While my father was in those offices trying to gain control over my finances, I was literally fighting for my life in an operating room just floors above. The internal bleeding that had developed was serious enough that Dr. Williams later told me they'd been genuinely concerned about my survival. But instead of being in a waiting room, praying for my recovery like normal parents would be, mine were downstairs trying to figure out how to access my money. Amanda's investigation had uncovered even more troubling details. The hospital's social work department had noted several concerning interactions with my family during my stay. When social workers attempted to assess my support system and discharge planning needs, my parents had been evasive about their involvement in my recovery. They'd made it clear that they expected me to manage my own care once released, that they were too busy with work obligations to provide assistance. But their attitude had changed dramatically whenever conversations turned to financial matters. Suddenly they became very interested and involved, asking detailed questions about insurance coverage, out-of-pocket expenses, and procedures for accessing patient resources. They'd even suggested that I might need long-term care that would require significant financial resources, hinting that they should be involved in managing those decisions. The social worker had found their behavior strange enough to document concerns about potential financial exploitation. She'd noted that the family seemed more interested in the patient's financial situation than her medical condition or emotional well-being. She'd recommended that any financial decision-making should involve the patient directly once she was capable of participating, and that outside oversight might be appropriate given the family dynamics she'd observed. As Amanda shared these discoveries, I felt a sick understanding wash over me. My family hadn't just abandoned me during a medical crisis, they'd been actively working to exploit my vulnerability, using my incapacitation as cover for a calculated plan to steal my inheritance. The emergency surgery that had terrified me and left me fighting for survival had represented opportunity to them, a chance to claim financial control while I was too weak to resist. But the most chilling detail was yet to come. Amanda had also accessed records from the day I'd finally regained full consciousness and begun asking questions about my family's absence. That same day, my father had made one final call to the hospital's patient advocacy department. This time, he'd asked about the legal implications of a patient making decisions while under the influence of pain medications. He'd suggested that I might be incapacitated by drugs and therefore unable to make sound financial choices, and he'd inquired about extending medical power of attorney even after a patient appeared to be recovered. The advocate had firmly told him that conscious patients retained full decision-making authority regardless of prescribed medications, unless there was clear evidence of severe cognitive impairment. My father had pressed the issue, asking about procedures for challenging a patient's mental capacity if family members believed medications were affecting their judgment. The advocate had become suspicious enough of his persistence that she'd flagged the conversation for potential elder abuse protocols, even though I didn't technically qualify due to my age. That final phone call revealed the desperation behind their scheme. As I'd begun recovering and asking questions, they'd realized their window of opportunity was closing. They'd been scrambling for legal avenues to maintain control, even considering having me declared mentally incompetent due to medication use. The depths of their willingness to exploit my vulnerability were becoming clearer with each piece of evidence Amanda uncovered. Armed with this information, I asked Amanda to help me contact Mr. Peterson again. This time, I wanted to understand exactly what pressure my family had been applying and what legal maneuvering they'd attempted regarding my grandmother's trust fund. What he told me during that second conversation completed the picture of their betrayal and gave me the motivation I needed to fight back with everything I had. Mr. Peterson explained that the pressure from my family had escalated significantly after my surgery. My father had called his office multiple times, each conversation becoming more aggressive and demanding. He'd claimed that I was in a coma with uncertain prospects for recovery, that someone needed to take control of my finances immediately to ensure my medical needs were met. He'd even suggested that my grandmother would have wanted the family to use the money for my care rather than letting it sit unused while I was incapacitated. When Mr. Peterson had insisted on waiting for my direct authorization, my father had threatened to seek legal intervention. He'd claimed that the lawyer was being negligent by allowing an incapacitated person's finances to remain frozen while medical bills accumulated. He'd mentioned consulting with other attorneys about forcing the release of the funds through court action, using my medical condition as justification for emergency financial management. But the most revealing conversation had occurred just days before I'd regained enough strength to make my own phone calls. Mike had visited Mr. Peterson's office in person, bringing what he claimed were medical documents proving my incapacitation and cognitive impairment. These documents, which Mr. Peterson now realized were likely fabricated or exaggerated, had painted a picture of someone unlikely to recover full mental capacity and therefore unable to manage significant financial assets. Mike had presented a detailed argument about why the family should have access to the trust fund. He'd claimed that my medical expenses would likely exhaust my insurance coverage, that I'd need long-term care that would require private funding, and that my grandmother's money was the most logical source for these expenses. He'd even brought a budget breakdown showing projected costs for my care, as if he'd been planning this financial takeover for weeks. Mr. Peterson had remained firm in his refusal to release the funds without my direct consent, but he admitted that the family's pressure had been relentless and increasingly sophisticated. They'd clearly researched the legal processes for gaining control over incapacitated persons' assets, and they'd been preparing to pursue every possible avenue to access my inheritance. The only thing that had stopped them was my unexpected recovery and my direct contact with his office. As I listened to Mr. Peterson describe their systematic attempts to steal my inheritance, I felt something shift inside me. The hurt and confusion I'd been feeling began transforming into something harder and more focused. This wasn't just about neglect or family dysfunction, this was deliberate theft, attempted while I was literally fighting for my life in a hospital bed. They'd seen my suffering as an opportunity, and they'd been disappointed when I survived to interfere with their plans. That afternoon, I made a decision that would change the trajectory of everything that followed. I asked Amanda to help me document every piece of evidence we'd uncovered, and I called a lawyer whose name she'd gotten from colleagues who dealt with medical malpractice and family exploitation cases. His name was David Chen, and he specialized in cases involving financial abuse of vulnerable adults. When I explained my situation to David over the phone, his response was immediate and decisive. He said he'd seen similar cases before, where family members tried to exploit medical emergencies for financial gain, and he assured me that what my family had attempted was both illegal and prosecutable. He said the evidence Amanda and I had gathered was stronger than most victims ever managed to collect, particularly the documented hospital communications that showed their true motivations. David explained that we had grounds for both criminal and civil action against my family. The criminal aspects included attempted fraud, conspiracy to commit theft, and potentially elder abuse statutes that protected vulnerable adults regardless of age. The civil components could include damages for emotional distress, lost opportunity costs, and punitive measures designed to prevent future exploitation attempts. But he also warned me that pursuing legal action against family members was emotionally devastating, that it would likely destroy any possibility of future relationships with my parents and brother. He said I should be prepared for them to retaliate with their own accusations, that they might claim I was mentally unstable or ungrateful, and that the process would be lengthy and expensive. As I lay in that hospital bed, still weak from surgery but stronger in my resolve than I'd ever been before, I told David that I was prepared for whatever came next. My family had already destroyed our relationships by viewing my near-death experience as a business opportunity. They'd forfeited any claim to my love or loyalty when they'd chosen to exploit my vulnerability instead of supporting my recovery. David scheduled a meeting for the following week, after I'd been discharged from the hospital. He said he wanted to begin building our case immediately, that the evidence was time-sensitive, and that we needed to act before my family realized their scheme had been discovered and began covering their tracks. That night, as I tried to sleep despite the pain and the emotional turmoil of everything I'd learned, I thought about my grandmother and the trust fund she'd left specifically for me. She'd wanted me to have independence and opportunities, to pursue my dreams without having to depend on anyone else for support. She'd probably never imagined that her own son would try to steal that gift while his daughter lay unconscious in a hospital bed. But her bequest was going to serve exactly the purpose she'd intended, just not in the way anyone could have predicted. That money would give me the resources I needed to fight back against the people who'd betrayed me, to ensure that they faced consequences for their cruelty and greed. My grandmother's final gift wouldn't just provide for my future, it would fund the battle that would expose my family's true nature and ensure they could never exploit anyone this way again. The next morning brought a visit from my parents that confirmed everything Amanda and I had discovered and set the stage for the confrontation that would eventually play out in that Phoenix courtroom. Their behavior during that hospital visit would provide the final pieces of evidence I needed to destroy them completely. My parents finally decided to grace me with their presence on my 19th day in the hospital, just 2 days before my scheduled discharge. I heard their voices in the hallway before they entered my room, my mother's sharp tone cutting through the ambient hospital noise, as she complained to my father about parking fees and how inconvenient the hospital's location was for their busy schedules. Even in those first overheard words, there was no mention of concern for my condition or relief that I was finally recovering. When they walked through my door, the performance they put on was almost impressive in its calculated nature. My mother immediately rushed to my bedside with exaggerated concern, her hands fluttering over my blankets as she made worried sounds about how pale and thin I looked. My father positioned himself at the foot of the bed with his arms crossed, wearing the expression he typically reserved for business meetings where he was about to deliver bad news to clients. My mother's voice carried that artificially sweet tone she used when she wanted something but was trying to appear caring. She asked how I was feeling, whether the doctors were treating me well, and if I needed anything to make my recovery more comfortable. But there was something hollow about her performance, as if she were reading from a script rather than expressing genuine emotion. Her eyes kept darting to my father, as if seeking approval for her words or waiting for cues about what to say next. My father took control of the conversation within minutes, steering it away from my health and toward practical matters that needed to be addressed before my discharge. He explained that they'd been extremely busy with critical business decisions at the insurance agency, that Mike had been handling most of the client interactions, while they dealt with expansion opportunities that could determine the company's future. He made it sound as if their absence during my medical crisis had been a noble sacrifice for the greater good of family financial security, but it was the way he introduced the topic of my grandmother's estate that confirmed everything Amanda and I had discovered about their true intentions. He mentioned it casually, as if it were just another administrative detail to handle during my recovery. He said that Mr. Peterson had been calling with questions about estate procedures, that there were documents requiring my signature, and that the family needed to coordinate on financial matters to ensure everything was handled properly. My mother chimed in with comments about how complicated estate law could be, how easy it was for people to make mistakes when they weren't thinking clearly, and how fortunate I was to have family members who understood business and legal matters. She suggested that I might want to give them temporary authority to handle these complex issues, while I focused on recovering my strength, emphasizing how overwhelming financial decisions could be for someone who'd been through such a traumatic medical experience. Their approach was sophisticated and manipulative, designed to make their theft attempt seem like protective concern rather than exploitation. They painted themselves as responsible family members trying to shield me from stress and complexity, while positioning me as someone too fragile and inexperienced to handle important financial decisions. It was exactly the kind of gaslighting that had characterized my relationship with them for years, but now it carried the additional cruelty of targeting me while I was genuinely vulnerable. I decided to test how far they were willing to go with their deception. I told them I appreciated their concern, but that I felt strong enough to handle my own affairs, that I planned to contact Mr. Peterson directly to understand what needed to be done with grandmother's estate. The change in their demeanor was immediate and revealing. My father's jaw tightened, and my mother's artificial sweetness developed a sharp edge as she insisted that I shouldn't rush into important decisions while still recovering from major surgery. My father launched into a detailed explanation of why immediate family involvement was crucial for estate matters. He claimed that there were time-sensitive tax implications, that delays could result in financial penalties, and that my grandmother's wishes could be compromised if proper procedures weren't followed quickly. He said he'd already consulted with tax attorneys, who'd advised that someone with business experience should coordinate the estate settlement to avoid costly mistakes. When I pressed for specifics about these supposed tax issues and time constraints, his answers became vague and contradictory. He couldn't explain exactly what penalties we might face or what specific deadlines were involved. My mother tried to support his claims by adding details about complex legal requirements, but her knowledge was clearly superficial and scripted. It became obvious that they'd prepared talking points designed to pressure me into signing over control, but they hadn't bothered to make their lies sophisticated enough to withstand basic questions. The conversation took a darker turn when I mentioned that I'd already spoken with Mr. Peterson about the estate. The color drained from my father's face, and my mother's hand gripped the bedrail so tightly her knuckles went white. My father demanded to know what Mr. Peterson had told me, his voice losing its carefully controlled tone and revealing the panic underneath. When I said the lawyer had explained that the estate was more substantial than I'd realized, my parents exchanged a look that confirmed their guilt more clearly than any confession could have. My mother tried to regain control of the narrative by suggesting that Mr. Peterson might have given me incomplete or confusing information, that estate details were often misunderstood by people without legal training. She said it would be better to have a family meeting with the lawyer where they could help interpret the complex legal language and ensure I understood all the implications of my inheritance. The paternalistic condescension in her voice made my skin crawl, particularly since I knew she was trying to manipulate me into a situation where they could pressure me more effectively. My father became more aggressive in his approach, abandoning the pretense of gentle concern. He said that as my parents, they had both the right and the responsibility to protect me from making financial mistakes that could impact my entire future. He claimed that young people often made impulsive decisions with inherited money, that without proper guidance, I could waste an opportunity that my grandmother had intended to provide long-term security. He went on to explain how the family business could benefit from additional capital investment, how my inheritance could be leveraged to create ongoing income, rather than being spent on immediate gratification. He painted a picture of responsible financial stewardship, where my money would be used to generate returns that would benefit everyone, rather than sitting idle or being squandered on what he called artistic pursuits that would never provide real financial security. The contempt in his voice when he mentioned my graphic design career was unmistakable. Despite my success at the marketing agency, despite my independence and financial stability, he still viewed my chosen profession as frivolous compared to the family insurance business. He clearly saw my inheritance as an opportunity to either force me into greater dependence on the family or to fund business expansion that he and Mike could control. My mother tried a different tactic, appealing to guilt and family loyalty. She reminded me of all the sacrifices they'd made to raise me, the money they'd spent on my education, and the support they'd provided throughout my childhood. She suggested that using my inheritance to strengthen the family business would be a way of honoring those investments and ensuring that future generations would benefit from my grandmother's generosity. She painted a picture of family solidarity, where individual inheritance was less important than collective success, where my grandmother's money could create a legacy that would last for decades rather than being consumed by a single person's immediate needs. It was a compelling narrative that might have worked on someone who hadn't discovered their attempted theft or experienced their complete abandonment during a medical crisis. But I'd learned too much about their true nature to be swayed by appeals to family loyalty from people who'd shown none when I was fighting for my life. I told them I needed time to think about their suggestions, that I wanted to discuss the estate with Mr. Peterson again before making any decisions. Their frustration was barely contained, as they realized their pressure tactics weren't working as effectively as they'd hoped. My father made one final attempt to establish control over the situation. He said that regardless of my feelings about family involvement, there were practical matters that couldn't be delayed. He claimed that medical bills from my hospital stay would need to be addressed soon, that my insurance might not cover all the expenses, and that my inheritance might be the most logical source for paying any outstanding costs. This was perhaps the most manipulative aspect of their entire visit. They were trying to create artificial urgency around my medical expenses, suggesting that I might need to access my inheritance immediately to cover costs that were actually being handled normally through insurance and hospital payment plans. They wanted me to believe that my financial situation was precarious, that I needed their guidance to navigate supposed crisis that didn't actually exist. When I told them that I'd already spoken with the hospital's billing department and that my insurance coverage was adequate, my father's mask of concerned parent finally slipped completely. He said that I was being naive about healthcare costs, that unexpected expenses always arose after major surgery, and that I'd regret not having immediate access to funds if complications developed. His tone had become threatening, as if he were warning me about consequences I'd face for not cooperating with their plans. My mother tried to smooth over his obvious frustration by returning to gentle manipulation, but the damage was done. Their visit had confirmed everything Amanda and I had suspected about their motivations. They weren't concerned about my health, my recovery, or my well-being. They'd seen my medical crisis as an opportunity to access money that my grandmother had specifically intended for me alone, and they were frustrated that their scheme wasn't proceeding as smoothly as they'd planned. After they left, promising to return the next day to continue our discussion about estate matters, I immediately called David Chen to report on their visit. He said their behavior was exactly what he'd expected based on my description of their attempted exploitation. He explained that their pressure tactics and misrepresentations about estate urgency were classic signs of financial abuse, and that their visit had provided additional evidence for our case. David said we needed to act quickly before they realized how much I knew about their scheme. He wanted to file legal documents that would prevent them from making any further attempts to access my inheritance or influence estate proceedings. He also suggested that we should document any future interactions with them, that their continued pressure could provide even stronger evidence of their predatory behavior. That evening, Amanda stopped by during her break to check on how the visit had gone. When I described my parents' behavior, the obvious desperation behind their manipulation attempts, her anger was fierce and protective. She said she'd never seen family members treat a patient with such calculated cruelty, that their timing made their actions particularly unconscionable. Amanda helped me understand something important about the psychology behind their behavior. She explained that people who exploit vulnerable family members often convince themselves that they're acting in everyone's best interests, that they deserve access to family resources, and that their victims are too weak or incompetent to make good decisions alone. She said my parents had probably rationalized their theft attempt as responsible financial management rather than acknowledging it as the predatory behavior it actually was. But she also warned me that people like my parents typically escalated their tactics when initial manipulation failed. She said they'd probably return with more aggressive pressure, more sophisticated lies, or attempts to isolate me from people who might interfere with their plans. She urged me to be careful about any future interactions with them and to document everything they said or did. Her warning proved prophetic. The next morning, before my parents' scheduled return visit, my father called the hospital claiming there was a family emergency that required my immediate attention. He said he was on his way to pick me up for an urgent meeting with lawyers about the estate, that delays could result in serious legal complications that would jeopardize my inheritance entirely. The nurse who took the call found his story suspicious enough to contact Dr. Williams before agreeing to discharge me early. Dr. Williams, who'd been concerned about my family's behavior throughout my stay, refused to authorize early discharge and called me to verify whether I wanted to leave with my father. When I told her about the pressure I'd been receiving and asked her to deny the request, she said she'd already planned to do exactly that. Williams explained that she'd noted concerning family dynamics in my medical records and that she had discretion to prevent discharge if she believed a patient might be in danger. She said my father's call had raised red flags because it contradicted the discharge plan we'd established, and because it seemed designed to remove me from the hospital environment where I had support and oversight. When my parents arrived that afternoon expecting to take me to their fabricated emergency meeting, they were informed that I wouldn't be discharged until the originally scheduled time and that I'd declined to leave early. Their reaction to this news provided the final confirmation of their true intentions and set the stage for the legal battle that would ultimately expose their crimes to the world. The confrontation that followed in the hospital hallway was loud enough to draw attention from staff and other visitors, and it revealed the depths of their entitlement and rage when their manipulation tactics failed. What they said during that public outburst would later be used as evidence in court, providing testimony that no skilled lawyer could explain away or minimize. When the nurse informed my parents that I wouldn't be leaving early and that their emergency meeting story had been rejected, my father's carefully constructed facade crumbled in spectacular fashion. The transformation was so complete and sudden that other families in the waiting area turned to stare as his voice rose to levels that echoed through the hospital corridors. This wasn't the controlled anger of a frustrated businessman, this was the raw fury of someone whose carefully planned scheme was falling apart. My father's first response was to demand an immediate meeting with hospital administration, claiming that they were interfering with family rights and preventing him from protecting his daughter's interests. His voice carried the entitled tone of someone accustomed to getting his way through intimidation and volume. He insisted that hospital staff had no authority to override parental decisions, that I was clearly not thinking rationally due to medication effects, and that they were enabling me to make choices that would have devastating long-term consequences. The duty nurse, a woman with decades of experience dealing with difficult family members, remained calm but firm in explaining that I was an adult patient with full decision-making capacity and that the hospital was legally obligated to respect my choices. She said that Dr. Williams had determined I was mentally competent and that my discharge plan would proceed as originally scheduled unless I personally requested changes. My mother tried to take a different approach, attempting to portray herself as a concerned parent being victimized by an ungrateful child and an uncooperative medical system. She spoke in a louder voice than necessary, clearly hoping to gain sympathy from other families in the area. She talked about the sacrifices they'd made to support me, the stress they'd endured during my medical crisis, and how heartbreaking it was to have their help rejected when they were only trying to protect my future. But her performance was undermined by the obvious insincerity in her voice and the calculated nature of her emotional displays. She kept glancing around to see if people were watching, adjusting her volume and tone based on her audience rather than expressing genuine distress. The other families in the waiting area seemed more uncomfortable than sympathetic, recognizing the manipulation attempt for what it was. When the nurse suggested they could wait until regular visiting hours to speak with me about their concerns, my father exploded with a tirade that revealed the true depth of his entitlement and rage. He said they'd wasted enough time accommodating hospital bureaucracy and my childish stubbornness that they had businesses to run and couldn't keep rearranging their schedules for someone who refused to appreciate their efforts to help. His use of the phrase childish stubbornness to describe my refusal to be manipulated was particularly telling. In his mind, any resistance to his control was immaturity rather than legitimate self-protection. He'd apparently convinced himself that his attempted theft of my inheritance was responsible parenting, and that my opposition to it was evidence of poor judgment rather than appropriate self-defense. Mike had been standing quietly behind our parents during this exchange, but he finally spoke up to support their position with arguments that revealed how deeply involved he'd been in planning their scheme. He claimed that I'd always been irresponsible with money, that I'd made poor financial decisions in the past, and that leaving me in control of a substantial inheritance would inevitably lead to waste and regret. His accusations were both false and hypocritical. Unlike him, I'd never asked the family for financial support after college, had built a successful career independently, and had maintained financial stability without their involvement. His claims about my supposed irresponsibility were pure fabrication designed to justify their attempted control over my inheritance. But Mike's involvement went deeper than just supporting our parents' manipulation. He began talking about specific plans for how my inheritance could be used to expand the family insurance business, mentioning details that revealed they'd been planning this exploitation for months rather than responding spontaneously to my medical crisis. He talked about property investments, equipment purchases, and staff expansion that could be funded through family collaboration on estate planning. The casual way he discussed spending my inheritance on his business interests was breathtaking in its presumption. He'd clearly assumed that gaining control over my grandmother's money was just a matter of waiting for the right opportunity and applying sufficient pressure. My medical emergency had provided that opportunity, and my unexpected resistance was simply an obstacle to be overcome through persistence and family solidarity arguments. As their arguments became more desperate and revealing, other people in the waiting area began openly staring at the spectacle my family was creating. Some looked sympathetic toward me, recognizing the manipulative behavior they were witnessing. Others seemed uncomfortable with the public nature of what was clearly a private family conflict, but my parents were too focused on their frustration to care about the impression they were making on strangers. My mother made one final attempt to regain control of the narrative by appealing directly to other families in the area. She spoke loudly about how difficult it was to watch an adult child make decisions that would harm their future, how painful it was to see someone reject help from people who loved them most. She was clearly hoping that other parents would identify with her position and perhaps pressure me to reconsider my refusal to cooperate. But her strategy backfired when an elderly man visiting his own hospitalized daughter spoke up in my defense. He said that he'd been watching their interaction and that their behavior reminded him of people he'd known who tried to take advantage of family members during vulnerable times. He pointed out that if they were truly concerned about my well-being, they would respect my wishes and support my recovery rather than creating stress and conflict. His intervention seemed to break whatever remaining restraint my father had been maintaining. He turned on the stranger with vicious personal attacks, calling him senile and suggesting that he mind his own business instead of interfering in family matters he couldn't understand. He said that outsiders had no right to judge family dynamics, and that the man's comments proved how easy it was for manipulative people to gain sympathy by playing victim. The irony of my father accusing someone else of manipulation while engaged in his own elaborate scheme was apparently lost on him. His attack on a random stranger who'd merely observed their behavior accurately demonstrated the lengths to which he'd go to maintain control over situations he felt entitled to dominate. Security personnel had been summoned by this point, and their arrival seemed to shock my parents into realizing how public and inappropriate their behavior had become. But instead of apologizing or attempting to de-escalate the situation, they doubled down by claiming that hospital staff were discriminating against them and preventing them from exercising their parental rights. My father demanded to speak with the hospital's chief administrator, threatening legal action if they continued to interfere with family decisions about my care and discharge planning. He claimed that their policies were discriminatory and that they'd created liability for themselves by enabling an incompetent patient to make decisions that would result in financial harm. The security supervisor, a calm professional who'd clearly dealt with similar situations before, explained that the hospital was legally required to respect patient autonomy and that interfering with an adult patient's decision-making would actually create liability rather than prevent it. He said that if they continued to disrupt hospital operations or harass staff, they would be asked to leave the premises and could be banned from visiting altogether. This threat finally penetrated my parents' rage enough to make them realize that their public outburst was counterproductive to their goals. But instead of genuinely backing down, they shifted to making threats about future consequences I'd face for my lack of cooperation. They said I'd regret rejecting their help when I found myself overwhelmed by financial and legal complexities I couldn't handle alone. My mother's parting words were particularly cruel and revealing. She said that I'd always been selfish and ungrateful, that I'd never appreciated the sacrifices they'd made for me, and that my current behavior proved I didn't deserve the inheritance my grandmother had left. She said that my grandmother would be ashamed to see how I was treating the family she'd loved, and that I was dishonoring her memory by refusing to work collaboratively on estate matters. The manipulation was sophisticated in its cruelty. She was trying to make me feel guilty about protecting myself from their theft by claiming that my resistance was betraying my grandmother's wishes. She was attempting to reframe their attempted exploitation as family cooperation and my self-defense as selfish individualism. But her words also revealed something important about their mindset. They genuinely believed they were entitled to access my inheritance, that my grandmother's specific bequest to me was somehow a family asset rather than a personal gift. They'd convinced themselves that their attempted theft was justified, and that my resistance was evidence of character flaws rather than appropriate boundary setting. After they finally left, the waiting area gradually returned to normal, but the effects of their outburst lingered. Other families looked at me with mixtures of sympathy and curiosity, clearly wondering what circumstances had led to such a public display of family dysfunction. Some offered supportive comments about standing up for myself, while others seemed uncomfortable with having witnessed such private conflict. The elderly man who defended me approached to check on how I was handling the situation. He said he'd recognized the manipulation tactics my parents were using because he'd seen similar behavior in his own extended family when inheritance issues arose. He warned me that people who felt entitled to other people's money often escalated their tactics when initial approaches failed, and he urged me to be careful about protecting myself legally and financially. His validation was enormously helpful because it confirmed that their behavior was as inappropriate as it had seemed to me. Sometimes when you're the target of manipulation, especially from family members, you begin questioning your own perceptions and wondering if you're overreacting to normal family dynamics. Having an objective observer recognize and validate the predatory nature of their behavior helped solidify my resolve to fight back legally. Dr. Williams appeared shortly after the commotion ended, having been informed about the incident by nursing staff. She said she'd made notes in my medical record about the family conflict and the concerning behavior she'd witnessed from my parents throughout my stay. She explained that these observations could be relevant if there were ever legal questions about my mental capacity or family dynamics during my hospitalization. She also took the opportunity to have a serious conversation with me about safety planning for after my discharge. She said that family members who'd attempted financial exploitation during a medical crisis often intensified their efforts once the victim was no longer under hospital protection. She urged me to have legal representation in place before leaving the hospital and to consider staying somewhere other than my usual residence if I felt unsafe. Her concern was both touching and sobering. As a medical professional, she'd seen enough family exploitation cases to recognize the warning signs and understand the potential for escalation. Her willingness to document the concerning behavior and advise me about safety planning demonstrated the kind of professional support that made my eventual legal victory possible. That evening, I called David Chen to report on the day's events and the public display my family had created. His response was immediate satisfaction rather than surprise. He said that family members engaged in financial exploitation often revealed their true nature when their manipulation attempts failed, and that their public outburst would provide excellent evidence for our legal case. David explained that their behavior demonstrated several key elements of financial abuse cases: their sense of entitlement to my inheritance, their attempts to undermine my decision-making capacity, their escalation when gentle manipulation failed, and their willingness to create public scenes rather than respect my boundaries all supported our arguments about their predatory intentions. He said we needed to move quickly to file legal documents that would protect my inheritance and establish a record of their attempted exploitation. He wanted to seek restraining orders that would prevent them from contacting Mr. Peterson about the estate and from attempting to gain any form of financial control over my assets. He also suggested that we should document their threats about future consequences, as these could be relevant if they attempted retaliation. The conversation with David helped me understand that my family's public meltdown had actually strengthened our legal position significantly. Their inability to maintain their facade of concerned parenting when faced with resistance had revealed their true motivations in ways that would be impossible to deny or explain away in court. Amanda stopped by that evening to check on how I was processing the day's events. When I described the scene my parents had created and the threats they'd made about future consequences, her reaction was fierce protectiveness mixed with professional concern. She said that in her experience, family members who threatened retaliation for refusing exploitation often followed through with increasingly desperate attempts to regain control. She helped me develop practical strategies for protecting myself after discharge. We discussed safety measures for my apartment, communication strategies that would minimize their opportunities for manipulation, and support systems I could rely on if they escalated their pressure tactics. Her practical advice complemented David's legal guidance and helped me feel more prepared for whatever they might attempt next. That night, as I tried to process everything that had happened during my parents' visit and its explosive aftermath, I realized that their public breakdown had actually been a gift. Their inability to control their rage when their scheme was thwarted had revealed their true nature in ways that no amount of investigation could have uncovered. Their sense of entitlement to my inheritance, their willingness to exploit my medical vulnerability, and their complete lack of genuine concern for my well-being had all been exposed for anyone to see. My grandmother's inheritance wasn't just going to provide financial security for my future, it was going to fund the legal battle that would ensure my family faced consequences for their betrayal, and that other vulnerable people would be protected from their predatory behavior. The money she'd left to support my independence would ultimately purchase something even more valuable: justice and the peace of mind that comes from fighting back against people who see kindness as weakness and vulnerability as opportunity. The stage was now set for a legal confrontation that would expose every aspect of their attempted theft and ensure that their public humiliation in that hospital waiting area was just the beginning of the consequences they'd face for trying to exploit their own daughter during the most vulnerable period of her life. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.